The sound was small in all that empty land. A thin, choked cry, barely there, carried on the Wyoming wind. Samuel Thornton reined in his black stallion, the leather creaking in the sudden silence. He listened, not with his ears but with his gut. That sound was wrong. It was the sound of something breaking. Another faint moan drifted from a stand of cottonwoods near a broken-down homestead, a place ghosts would call home. His hand, calloused and sure, found the smooth wood grip of the Colt at his hip. The sun was bleeding out across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rust and mourning. The land was quiet, and Trouble always loved quiet places. He dismounted, the horse barely making a sound in the thick dust. He didn't bother with the sagging porch. He put his boot to the door, and it swung inward with a groan of dying wood. Dust motes danced like spirits in the last rays of light. The roof was a skeleton against the sky, but the smell hit him first. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, sweat, old metallic blood, and underneath it all, the raw, sharp tang of pure terror. In the far corner, almost lost in the gloom, a shape resolved itself into a person, a young woman, bound hand and foot, like an animal ready for market. A filthy strip of burlap was tied so tight across her mouth it looked like it was part of her skin. Her blue calico dress was shredded. Dark matted hair clung to her cheeks. But her eyes were wide and wet, in screaming things her mouth couldn't. "Easy now," Samuel said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from too many days, with only the wind for company. He holstered his gun. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what had been done to her. He knelt, pulling his knife. The blade was clean and sharp. She flinched as he reached behind her, the animal part of her brain expecting another blow. He worked the knot at the back of her head, and with a final slice, pulled the gag free. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She just gasped, a terrible, ragged sound of lungs that had forgotten how to work. Her chest heaved. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. And then she whispered 3 words that split him clean in 2. "I can't breathe." For a single blinding moment, he wasn't in that shack. He was somewhere else 5 years ago. He could smell smoke, feel the blistering heat of a fire he couldn't reach in time. He could hear a smaller voice, calling for him from inside a burning cabin. He forced the memory down, burying it deep where it couldn't hurt him anymore. He cut the rope at her ankles, his movements swift and sure. "Can you sit up?" he asked. She nodded, a tiny jerky motion. When she tried, she swayed like a newborn foal. He steadied her, his hand on her shoulder. In the dim light, he saw it all. The rope burns on her wrists, rubbed raw and bloody, the ugly purple bruises blooming on her arms, the hollow gray look of a body that had given up on water. He brought his canteen to her lips. "Slow," he commanded. She obeyed, her eyes never leaving his face. They were dark, bottomless pits of fear. He was just a man, a stranger. But right now, he was the only thing in her world that wasn't a monster. "How long?" he asked. Her voice was a rasp, a dry leaf skittering across stone. 2 days, maybe 3. She coughed, a dry, painful sound. "They left me." "Who?" Pure terror flashed across her face again, wiping away the brief flicker of hope. "They'll come back." Samuel looked around the broken-down shack, then back at her. A cold, hard certainty settled in his bones. "Not while I'm here," he said, and he meant it. She was as light as a bird when he lifted her, all sharp bones and fragile heat. He set her on his horse, the big stallion shifting but standing steady. "My name is Samuel Thornton. I own the Triple T north of here," he said, swinging up behind her. "You're safe now." She said the word safe like it was a foreign language she'd once read in a book. He wrapped one arm firmly around her waist to hold her steady. She tensed, a full-body flinch, then sagged back against his chest, too weak to fight, too tired to do anything else. They rode through the fading light, the world turning to shades of deep blue and charcoal. Finally, the lights of the Triple T rose out of the dusk. Barns, corrals, a long bunkhouse, and the big main house, its windows glowing with warm, yellow light. It was an island of order in a wild land. Men stopped their chores and stared. Their boss was a solitary man. He worked hard, he paid fair, but he never ever brought anyone home, especially not a woman in tatters. Jake! Samuel's voice cut through the evening air. His foreman, a hard man with granite eyes that missed nothing, came striding out of the main barn. He took in the scene in a single glance. Samuel, the girl. The way she was slumped against him. His face didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Ride for Doc Morrison, Samuel ordered. Now. Yes, sir. Jake was already turning, heading for the stables without another word. Inside, Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who had run the big house since Samuel's wife was alive, took one look and her face set into a mask of grim efficiency. Poor child, she clucked, already moving, her mind a whirlwind of hot water, clean clothes, and strong broth. Go on, Mr. Thornton. Let me do my work. Samuel hesitated at the door to the guest room. The girl, lying on a clean bed for the first time in days, watched him with those dark, haunted eyes. Thank you, she whispered. The words were small, but they landed in the quiet of the house like stones. He just nodded and walked out, but her voice followed him down the hall to his study. He poured a heavy glass of whiskey and stared into the amber liquid, trying to quiet the old familiar ache in his chest. It had been 5 years since the stagecoach robbery. 5 years since he'd lost his wife, Sarah, and their little girl, Emma. 5 years of building fences, counting cattle, and feeling absolutely nothing. He told himself this was just simple decency, a duty. Help her, find out where she belongs, then send her on her way. That was all this was. That was the lie he told himself anyway. But as he sat there, the storm in his own heart began to brew, one that would be far worse than any that ever crossed the Wyoming plains. He had opened a door he thought was locked forever, and he was about to find out what monsters were waiting on the other side. Morning came with thin light filtering through the lace curtains and the comforting smell of coffee and frying bacon. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the raw terror in the girl's gaze, heard her whisper, "I can't breathe." She came to his study just as he was finishing his coffee. Mrs. Chen had worked a small miracle. Her dark hair was clean and braided down her back. She wore a simple brown dress that, while too big, was spotless. The bruises were fading from purple to a sickly yellow, but the haunted look in her eyes hadn't changed. She looked small, but steadier. "Please sit," Samuel said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you." She folded her hands in her lap, a nervous habit. "I'm Grace, Grace McKenna." "Grace," he repeated the name. It felt strange on his tongue. "Doc Morrison says rest and food will set you right. You can stay as long as you need." "I don't want to be a burden." "It's no trouble." His tone was flat, leaving no room for argument. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the polished wood of his desk. The pleasantries were over. "I need to ask you, Grace. Who did this to you?" She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Tom Carroll," she said, the name a poison in her mouth. "And his men. They run a business in Laramie." "What kind of business?" "They promise jobs to girls traveling alone. Seamstresses, shop girls, governesses. They meet the trains. They're kind. They offer a place to stay." Her voice trembled. "When the girls arrive, there are contracts. Debts for travel, for food, for lodging. Debts you can never repay." She touched the angry red marks on her wrists. "And if you try to run, they make sure you learn your lesson." Samuel's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He'd heard whispers in town, dark rumors about Kirill and his enterprises. Rumors he, and most other folks, had chosen to ignore. It was easier to look the other way. "You were headed west?" he asked, his voice low. "To an aunt in California," she said. "I sold everything I had for the train fare. A well-dressed woman, Mrs. Dalton, she met me at the station in Laramie." She smiled. "She said she had a position for me at a fine dress shop. I believed her." Shame colored her voice, turning her cheeks pink. "I slipped away 3 nights ago. They caught me. They left me in that shack to think about my choices." A cold fire began to burn in Samuel's gut. "You're under my protection now," he said, the words coming out like chips of stone. "They won't touch you here." "You don't understand," she whispered, her eyes wide with a fear he was beginning to recognize. It wasn't just fear of a beating. It was fear of something bigger, something with deep roots. They have friends, important friends, even, even some of the lawmen. And I have 20 riders who are loyal to this ranch, Samuel countered, his voice hard, and a very long reach. If we need the law, we'll get the real law. Before he could say more, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed in the yard. The door to his study burst open without a knock. It was Jake, his face grim. Boss, riders coming up the north road. 3 of them. Samuel was on his feet in an instant, every line of him rigid. Asking for what? Asking about a runaway girl. The air in the room went cold. Grace had gone pale, her hand flying to her mouth. How far out? Samuel asked Jake. 10 minutes, maybe less. Tell the boys to keep working, but keep their rifles close. I'll meet these men at the main gate. Alone. He then turned to Grace, his eyes softening just a fraction. Jake, take Miss McKenna down to the root cellar. Bar the door from the outside. No, Grace said, standing so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, surprising fire. I won't hide. I'm tired of running. This isn't a debate, Miss McKenna, Samuel said, his voice gentle but laced with iron. He nodded to Jake, who took her arm. She didn't fight, but as he guided her out, she looked back at Samuel, and in her eyes he saw not just fear, but a plea not to let the monsters win. Samuel buckled on his gun belt, the weight of the Colt familiar and grimly comforting against his hip. He stepped out onto the wide porch. The sky had turned a bruised, ugly gray. Clouds were crawling in over the mountains. A storm was brewing, both in the sky and in his yard. He took his place at the gate, thumbs hooked in his belt, his face a mask of cold calm. His body was ready. Behind him in the shadows of the barns and the bunkhouse, he could feel the presence of his men. They were there. They were ready, too. 3 riders emerged from the dust. They had hard faces and mean, restless eyes. The kind of men who smiled when they broke things. The leader, a man with greasy black hair and a puckered white scar bisecting his cheek, pulled his horse to a halt. He tried to smile, but it was a predator's grin. Mornin', friend. Name's Bill Hartley. We're tracking some property that wandered off. The valuable kind. This is private land, Samuel said, his voice flat and even. There's no property like that here. Hartley's smile thinned. A girl. Dark hair. About 20. Poor thing's not right in the head. Her family's mighty worried. Haven't seen anyone like that, Samuel lied without blinking. Mind if we take a look around? Hartley's voice was still friendly, but there was a razor's edge underneath it. Wouldn't want you to get in trouble for harboring a debtor. I do mind. One of the younger riders, jumpy and eager, leaned forward, his hand hovering near the butt of his pistol. You know who you're talking to, old man. Mr. Carrill doesn't like being told no. Samuel's eyes, cold as a winter river, shifted to the young man. Then Mr. Carrill and I have that in common, he said. The yard went so quiet you could hear the wind whispering secrets in the cottonwoods. Hartley's hand drifted toward his own pistol, then stopped. He looked at Samuel, standing there, still as a mountain, with eyes that promised nothing but pain. And for the first time, Bill Hartley hesitated. He saw something in this rancher that wasn't on the books, something that wasn't for sale and couldn't be broken. This ain't over, Hartley spat, his mask of friendliness gone. Mr. Carrill has papers on that girl. Debt bonds, legal and binding. You block a lawful recovery, you'll answer to Judge Harwick himself. I look forward to it, Samuel said. Now get off my land. They wheeled their horses around and galloped off, the dust swallowing them whole. Samuel watched them go, his hand never leaving his gun. He held his position at the gate for a long moment after they were gone, then turned. The storm was closer now. He could smell the rain. Jake, he called out, bring Miss McKenna back to the house, then send a rider to town. I want Marshal Brennan out here, before nightfall. He climbed the porch steps, the old wood groaning under his weight. Inside somewhere, a young woman was trying to be brave, and Samuel felt the old, frozen walls inside him begin to crack. He had told himself he would just help her and send her on her way. It was the safe, sensible thing to do. But the moment Hartley said the word property, something cold and hard and final had settled in Samuel Thornton's heart. The fight was coming. He knew it. And this time, He would not be too late. The storm clouds rolled in from the Laramie Mountains before noon, thick and bruised-looking. The wind carried the sharp smell of rain and the metallic taste of trouble. Inside the big house, in the quiet of his study, Samuel sat across from Grace. Her hands were steadier now, clasped around a mug of warm tea. Her voice was, too. She told him everything. About the smartly dressed woman, Mrs. Dalton, who found her at the depot. About the kind words and the warm tea that led to a locked room in a yellow boarding house on Elm Street. About a ledger book filled with phantom debts she never incurred. She told him how Tom Carroll's men watched the doors, watched the streets, watched the girls until their hope went thin and small and finally disappeared altogether. "You were alone," Samuel said, more to himself than to her. "They hunt for that." Grace lifted her chin, and a flicker of the fire he'd seen earlier returned to her eyes. "Not anymore." And in that moment, something shifted in him. This was no longer about a debt of decency. This was about a line. Kirill had crossed it, and Samuel was going to make him pay. They rode into the nearby town of Cedar Ridge that afternoon. The official reason was supplies. The real reason was to read the town, to see the enemy on his own ground. The main street was busy with drovers, buyers, and families in for provisions. But there was a tension in the air, a watchfulness that felt wrong. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, Tom Kirill held court. He was dressed in a fine suit that couldn't hide the cruelty in his eyes or the predator's stillness in his posture. He was surrounded by men like Hartley, men with guns on their hips and emptiness in their souls. Samuel pushed through the bat-wing doors. The room went quiet. Every eye turned to him. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. "Mr. Thornton?" Kirill said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He spread his hands in a gesture of welcome that was anything but. "To what do we owe the pleasure? Join me for a drink." "I'll stand," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I have one thing to say to you. Miss McKenna is not property." Kirill's smile was all teeth. It didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper. "She signed a contract, an advance of $300 for travel and board. Then she ran." He laid the paper on the table. "Judge Harwick himself will confirm the legality of this document." "I've seen your kind of law," Samuel said, his voice dangerously low. "It stinks of money and fear." From a nearby table, Bill Hartley, the man with the scarred cheek, rose slowly to his feet. His hand hovered over the butt of his gun. "You calling the judge a liar, Thornton?" "I'm calling you out of my way," Samuel said, his gaze never leaving Kirill. "Tell your boss to keep his distance from my ranch, and from the girl." He turned and walked out. The silence held until the bat-wing doors swung shut behind him. He could feel their eyes on his back, a physical pressure. He knew this was just the beginning. People on the street watched him from doorways, from behind curtains, then quickly looked away when he met their gaze. Fear was a sickness in this town, and Tom Kirill was the plague. At Morrison's Dry Goods, the old owner, a man Samuel had known for years, spoke in a hushed whisper while weighing out flour. "Be careful, Samuel. Judge Harwick is coming to town tomorrow." "Heard Kirill's getting warrants signed." Across the street, a woman stepped out from the bank. It was Margaret Sinclair, the banker's wife. She was a stern, church-going woman with a spine of steel. She walked directly up to Samuel and, without a word, pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. 12 names, she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. 12 girls over the last 2 years. The dates they arrived in Laramie, the last place they were seen. They've all disappeared. She met his eyes and he saw a deep, burning anger there. "Not everyone in this town is blind, Mr. Thornton, but fear is a hard jail to break out of." He looked down at the list. A cold dread washed over him as he read the names. One of them felt familiar. Rebecca Paulson. She had worked for his wife, Sarah, for a summer, a sweet, quiet girl with a talent for embroidery. She left to find work in Cheyenne, or so everyone thought. Now it was personal, in a way he could never have imagined. Back at the Triple T, Samuel doubled the watch. He walked the fence lines at dusk, the setting sun casting his long shadow across the land. He was no longer just protecting a stranger. He was avenging a memory. He traced the smooth, worn wood of the porch rail, the same rail Sarah had leaned on, and felt a cold rage settle deep in his soul. After dark, he heard the rumble of thunder in the distance, long before the first drops of rain began to fall. But he also heard another sound, the sound of many horses moving fast, moving with purpose. They were coming. They came at daybreak, a posse of 20 men, fanned out in a rough half circle at the main gate. Tom Carrill was at the front, looking smug and confident. Beside him, in a fine black coat, sat a portly man with a sour face, Judge Harwick. And flanking them both, looking uncomfortable and out of his depth, was Sheriff Daniels, his badge catching the weak morning light. Samuel stood in the open, in the middle of his own yard, a Winchester rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. Behind him, his men were silent shadows in the windows of the house, in the haylofts of the barns, in the doorways of the bunkhouse. The Triple T was ready for a war. "Mr. Thornton," the judge called out, his voice thin and reedy, "I have a lawful warrant for the arrest and return of one Grace McKenna, a fugitive from a debt contract." "You have a piece of paper bought with a bribe," Samuel's voice rang out, clear and cold. "That is not the law, not on this land." "The court has ruled," Harwick insisted, his face turning blotchy and red. "Refuse to comply, and you will be charged with obstructing justice." Before Samuel could answer, the front door of the house opened. Grace stepped out onto the porch. Her hair was braided neatly, her chin was high, her eyes were clear and steady. "I will speak," she said, her voice stronger than Samuel had ever heard it. She walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at the men who had terrorized her. "I was taken by lies. I was held against my will. I was beaten for trying to leave. I owe no man a debt for my own chains." "You will be silent," Harwick snapped, his authority crumbling. "A contract breaker has no right to address the court." Samuel's voice dropped, becoming flat and deadly. "The only way she leaves this ranch is over my dead body." The yard went still as a frozen pond. The tension was a living thing, a wire pulled so tight it was about to snap. Carrill's hand moved toward his gun. Samuel's thumb rested on the hammer of his Winchester. Then Grace did something none of them expected. Not Carrill, not the judge, not even Samuel. She walked down the steps, her hands open at her sides, and moved toward the gate. "I will go," she said. Samuel felt the ground tilt beneath his feet. He lunged forward and caught her arm. "No." The word was torn from him. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw a terrifying mix of fear and cold, hard resolve. "You have a ranch to protect, Samuel. You have men whose lives are in your hands. I will not be the match that burns it all down." She stumbled just a little as she passed Jake, who had moved to stand near the porch steps. The foreman reached out a hand to steady her. It was a small, simple gesture. But in that brief touch, Samuel saw it. He saw Grace slip a small folded piece of paper into Jake's palm. Jake's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Grace, just once. A flicker of understanding. He palmed the note without a single wasted motion. Hartley, the man with the scar, dismounted and tied Grace's wrists in front of her with a rough leather thong. She stood tall, her back straight, refusing to show them an ounce of the terror she must have felt. "I have conditions," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority, speaking directly to Carrill. "You will mark my debt paid in full, on paper. You will sign a document releasing me from any and all claims, on paper. You will do it now, in front of these witnesses." Carrill actually laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You think you're in a position to bargain?" "You're a businessman, Mr. Carroll," Grace said, her voice like ice. "Do business with me. I give you what you want, me, quiet and compliant. I don't speak of what I know, but if you refuse—" She let the threat hang in the air. "What I know will travel. Names, places, buyers, even a certain judge's wife's birthday, the one he uses as the combination for his private safe." Judge Harwick went pale as a sheet. Carrill stopped laughing. He stared at Grace, really seeing her for the first time. Not as a victim, but as a threat. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. With a shaking hand, Harwick wrote out the release. Sheriff Daniels, his face a mask of misery, signed it as a witness. Grace took the paper, her knuckles white as she clutched it. She didn't look at Samuel. She couldn't. Kirill gathered his men, and with Grace mounted on a spare horse, they rode away, swallowed by the brewing storm. The yard stayed tense, silent, until the last rider had vanished over the rise. Only then did Samuel move. He strode over to Grace's empty spot, the ground feeling hollow and wrong. He turned to Jake. "What did she give you?" he demanded. Jake unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. The same list Margaret Sinclair had given Samuel, but with something new added at the bottom, a name and a series of numbers. "It's insurance," Jake said, his voice low with grudging admiration. "She told me, if anything happens to her, Marshal Brennan gets this. Both copies." Before the sun could even think about setting, a new group of riders clattered into the yard. It was U.S. Marshal Brennan, tall and spare, with eyes that saw everything and missed nothing. He was flanked by two grim-faced deputies. "Got a message from your man," Brennan said, dismounting. He glanced at the list Jake handed him. He nodded slowly. "These names, they match missing persons reports out of Laramie and Cheyenne. This is big. I can build a federal case against Kirill, but I need time. I need solid proof." "You won't get it," Samuel said, his eyes on the dark clouds that now covered the sky. "Kirill didn't get that paper, to be fair. He got it to shut her up. He'll strike back before dawn." He was right. As dusk settled, a new light appeared on the horizon, a hellish orange glow. Smoke smudged the evening sky over Cedar Ridge. From the high porch of the Triple T, they could see it clearly. The east barn was on fire. The herd, panicked by the flames, scattered across the plains. Samuel's men rode hard and put the flames down, but the message was clear. The release paper hadn't bought Grace's freedom. It had only bought a single day, and the clock was ticking. That night, the big kitchen of the Triple T became a war room. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Rain hissed against the glass like angry snakes. Around the heavy oak table sat Samuel, Jake, Marshal Brennan, and a young, eager deputy named Tom. And Grace. She sat straighter now, not as a victim, but as a strategist. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was tempered with something harder. Something that looked a lot like vengeance. "We run for Denver," the young deputy, Tom said. 3 days hard riding. Get her to federal protection. Build the case from there." "No," Grace said, her voice quiet but firm. "Running is what he wants. Running is what feeds men like Tom Kirill. We don't run. We fight." "We need proof," Brennan said, his gaze intense. "Something that will stand up in a federal court and put him away for good. His ledgers, his letters, anything that ties him to the judge in this operation." "Where does he keep them?" Jake asked, his brow furrowed. "In town? In his head, Man Hartley's saddlebags?" "He won't leave them where they can be found," Samuel said. "He's too smart for that." Grace shook her head slowly. "He won't leave them alone. He'll keep them close. He trusts no one." A thoughtful, dangerous look entered her eyes. "He trusts nothing. Nothing but greed." She looked directly at Samuel. "He'll leave them for gold." Samuel stared at her. "Gold?" She rose from the table, went to the small travel bag Mrs. Chen had given her, and returned. She set a small, heavy leather pouch on the table and loosened the drawstring. Nuggets, small but heavy, rolled out into the lamplight, gleaming with a soft, yellow fire. "Where did you get that?" Samuel asked, his voice rough. "From your lockbox in the study," she said softly. "The one you never opened. Mrs. Chen showed me." Her eyes were filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "It's your wife's jewelry, melted down. I'm so sorry, Samuel, but—" He stared at the gold, the last physical remnants of his wife and daughter. The ache in his chest was a physical thing, a crushing weight. But then he looked at Grace, at the fire in her eyes, at the righteous fury that burned there. He let out a slow, ragged breath. "You're not wrong," he said, his voice thick. "She would have used it to save someone." Grace's plan was simple, and it was terrifyingly risky. She would stumble back into Kirill's reach, not in town but out in the wilderness. She would have a story about a hidden cave she found while running, a cave filled with old Spanish treasure. She would use the nuggets as proof. She would bait his greed, a greed she knew was more powerful than his caution. She would draw him and his most trusted men and his precious ledgers away from the safety of the town and into the wild, into their trap. Devil's Canyon, Jake said immediately. It's a narrow gut, high walls, one way in, one way out. Perfect for an ambush. It's too dangerous, Samuel told Grace, the words catching in his throat. The thought of putting her back in that man's hands, even for a moment. She met his eyes and her gaze was unwavering. He chained me like an animal, Samuel. He left me to die. I choose this risk. I will not be a victim anymore. They left before dawn, riding for a small line shack high in the hills overlooking the valley. The weather turned and a freak early snow began to fall, dusting the pines in white. The little cabin was cold, but it held. They made coffee over a small fire, speaking in low, urgent voices, planning every detail. Twice, Samuel slipped out to check their back trail. No tracks, no watchers. On the third check, as the sun struggled to break through the gray, snow-filled sky, he found it. Sign. 2 sets of fresh tracks, cutting across the lower switchbacks. Carol's scouts. They were already sweeping the hills for her. It was time. Inside the cabin, Grace transformed. She brushed dirt on her cheeks. She tangled her clean hair until it looked wild and matted. She took off the warm woolens Mrs. Chen had provided and put on the torn blue calico dress. She looked once again like the broken girl Samuel had found in that abandoned homestead, except for the steel in her eyes. That was new, and it was terrifying. If I do not come back by sundown, she said to him, her voice low and steady, you ride for the canyon, and you do not wait for me. Samuel grabbed her hand. His own was trembling slightly. You come back. It wasn't an order. It was a prayer. I will try. She squeezed his fingers. A brief, warm pressure. We breathe together now. Remember? And then she was gone, slipping into the snow-dusted trees like a ghost. By mid-morning, Jake rode up from the valley, his horse steaming in the cold air. His face was grim, but his eyes held a spark of triumph. He took the bait, Jake said, swinging down from his horse. Hook, line, and sinker. 10 men riding with him, Hartley included. He's heading for Devil's Canyon right now. Jake paused, his gaze meeting Samuel's. The rest of his men? They're at your house, boss, and the judge is with them. Samuel felt a hot, white rage rise behind his ribs. They were in his home, Sarah's home. Then we split, Samuel said, his voice like flint. Jake, you take the canyon. Take our best men. I take the ranch. He turned to Marshal Brennan. Marshal, split your men. Cover both gates. No one gets out. The snow fell in fine, bright needles as the plan snapped into motion. High in the mountains, Grace McKenna, clutching a leather pouch that flashed yellow in the weak sun, stepped out of the pines and directly into Tom Carroll's path. And far below, Samuel Thornton and 2 of his best riders slid like shadows along his own fence lines, moving toward his own front door, where a crooked judge was leafing through his private letters with greedy, grasping hands. The Wild West held its breath and waited. Snow fell in thin white lines, a curtain dropping on a stage set for violence. Grace stumbled out onto the trail below the line shack, making sure she was seen. Her hair was a wild tangle, her dress torn, her face a mask of desperation. She clutched the small leather pouch of gold tight to her chest, as if it were her last and only hope. Kirill's scout saw her first, a sharp whistle cutting through the quiet air. Moments later, Kirill himself rode up, flanked by his 10 best men. Bill Hartley sat to his right, the white scar on his cheek standing out starkly against his cold-reddened skin. You again, Kirill said, a sneer twisting his lips. Decided you miss our hospitality? He nodded to 2 of his men. Bring her here. They dragged her through the snow to his horse. She didn't fight. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and raised the pouch, shaking it just enough for the nuggets inside to ring, together with a soft, promising clink. More, she gasped, her voice a convincing blend of fear and greed. In a cave, up in the hills, old Spanish gold. I can show you. Hartley narrowed his eyes, suspicious. Smells like a trick, boss. It smells like money, Carol corrected him, his eyes fixated on the pouch. He snatched it from her grasp, felt its weight, and a hungry grin spread across his face. "Tie her to a horse. We ride." They pushed hard toward Devil's Canyon, the wind driving the snow into their faces. The trail narrowed, becoming a tight throat of rock with sheer walls rising high and close on either side. It was a natural trap. Grace let herself stumble, letting out small cries of pain. She kept her eyes low, counting the turns in the trail, the landmarks she and Samuel had marked the night before. At the second bend, a sharp switchback marked by a dead lightning-scarred pine, she stopped. "Up ahead," she said, pointing a trembling finger toward a dark cleft in the rock face. "The cave. It's just above the wash." Kirill leaned down from his saddle, his face close to hers, his breath smelling of whiskey and rot. "If you're lying, girl," he hissed, "I'll throw you off the highest cliff myself." Grace looked past his shoulder, up toward the high, snow-dusted rim of the canyon, and she saw it, a small, quick flicker of a gloved hand. Jake's signal. They were in position. She took one slow, deep breath, held it, and then looked Kirill dead in the eye. "Right there," she said. The first shot cracked from the rim. Rocks spit from the canyon wall just inches from Kirill's head. Horses reared and screamed, their iron-shod hooves slipping on the icy stone. Men cursed, scrambling for cover that wasn't there. Jake and four of the best Triple T riflemen had the high ground. They knew the angles. They knew the plan. A second volley of shots rained down, not to kill, but to control. They cut Kirill's line of men in two with fast, hard, accurate fire, pinning them down. Grace didn't hesitate. She dove into a pre-planned cut in the canyon wall, pressing herself flat against the cold rock as bullets whined overhead. Hartley, ever the professional, fired two quick shots at the rim, then another at a shadow of a rider he spotted on the far side. Kirill dragged his horse behind a massive boulder and screamed for his men to push forward, to charge the ambush. But the canyon was a coffin. There was no room to charge, no way to flank. The rim was a knife held to their throats. Miles away, down in the valley, Samuel slid along the wall of his own kitchen, two of his ranch hands flanking him. Snow melted on his shoulders. He eased the back door open, the familiar creak unheard over the howl of the wind. The kitchen was empty, warm, and quiet, but voices came from the study. "I told you he was more than a simple rancher," Judge Harwick was saying, his voice smug. The sound of riffling papers followed. "Thornton plays the saint, but he writes to every railroad man in Cheyenne. We'll find something in here to ruin him, something to justify taking his land." Sheriff Daniels stood near the stove, twisting his hat in his hands. His face was pale, his eyes darting around nervously. "Judge, this doesn't sit right. Breaking into a man's home." "It sits where the money puts it," Harwick snapped, impatient. "Now help me look." Samuel stepped into the doorway. "Step away from my desk." The judge spun around, his face a comical mask of shock and fear. Daniels froze, his hand dropping to his gun, then stopping. Samuel's Colt was in his hand, held low but steady. His voice was calmer than his own raging heart. "Sheriff," Samuel said, his eyes locking onto the lawman, "take his gun." Daniels looked from the furious judge to the deadly calm rancher, and in that split second, he made a choice. He drew his pistol, but he didn't point it at Samuel. He stepped forward, disarmed the sputtering judge, and placed the man's fancy pistol on the desk. "You're a fool, Daniels," Harwick hissed. "Maybe I was," the sheriff said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not today." Samuel nodded once, a gesture of grim approval. He turned his cold gaze back to the judge. "Grace told me something interesting about your wife's birthday. Open your safe, Judge." Harwick's face drained of all color. He knew. Somehow the girl knew. With shaking hands, he crossed to a heavy corner cabinet, spun the dial, and swung the door wide. It was a treasure trove of corruption. Ledgers, sealed letters implicating men from Laramie to Denver, and a thick, bulging pouch of cash. "Take them, Sheriff," Samuel said. "All of them." Gunfire, distant but distinct, still rattled the air from the hills above the ranch. Samuel kept his gun on the judge, forcing him back into the desk chair. He slid a clean sheet of paper and a pen across the polished wood. "Write," Samuel commanded. Write what you've done, the names you took money from, the girls you signed warrants for, the deals you made with Kirill. We're going to end this in the light where your friends can't hide you." Harik stared at the blank page, a sliver of his old arrogance returning. "You won't shoot me? You're not a killer, Thornton." His hand trembled slightly as he said it. "Right," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "Or I swear by my wife and my little girl buried on that hill, I will drag you out to the yard and let this town be your judge and jury." The pen began to scratch across the paper. Back in Devil's Canyon, the fight was turning. A new shout came from the east rim, from the mouth of the canyon. Marshal Brennan, leading 6 deputies, appeared at the edge, their rifles ready. His voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls. "Tom Kirill, in the name of the United States government, drop your weapons. You are under arrest." Kirill, his face a mask of snarling fury, fired a wild shot up at the marshal. Brennan's rifle answered instantly. The shot was perfect. Kirill lurched, the bullet tearing through his shoulder, slamming him back against the rock. Hartley grabbed him, firing wildly to cover their retreat. Grace saw Hartley's boots crunching in the snow as he moved toward her hiding place. She held her breath, waiting until he passed. Then she sprang. The small, sharp knife Samuel had given her flashed once. She slashed the leather thong at her wrists and slid behind a fallen slab of granite just as Hartley wheeled around. He saw her, and a vicious grin split his face. "Got you now, you—" A single shot cracked from the rim. Jake's bullet hit Hartley square in the thigh. He dropped to one knee, raising his pistol to finish Grace. But 2 more rounds from the deputies on the rim slammed into his chest. He fell backward into the snow, his eyes wide, staring at the gray sky, his mouth working but making no sound. With their leader and their chief gunman down, Kirill's men broke. 2 made a run for the mouth of the canyon but were dropped by warning shots from the deputies. The rest threw their weapons into the wash and raised their hands high. "Tom Kirill, surrender," Brennan called out again. Bleeding, his face twisted with pain and hate, Kirill reached for a pistol with his good left hand. Grace stepped out from behind the rock. She stood in the open, where he could see her clearly. Her torn dress was dusted with snow. Her face was pale, but her voice was as steady as the stone around them. "It's over, Tom." His hand faltered. In her eyes, he didn't see fear. He saw justice. 2 deputies slid down the scree slope, kicked his gun away, and hauled him to his feet. Jake scrambled down from his ledge and reached Grace first. "You all right, miss?" She nodded, though her knees were shaking so hard she could barely stand. "I am now." Jake tipped his hat, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "That was a smart plan." Grace looked at Kirill, swaying between the 2 deputies, his face a mask of defeat. "I want his books," she said. Brennan was already searching Kirill's saddlebags. He pulled out a hardbound ledger and a thick bundle of contracts tied with string. He held them up for her to see. "We have them," he said. The snow began to ease, the wind died down, and the canyon held a new, different kind of quiet. Back at the Triple T, the judge finished writing. Sheriff Daniels read the confession, his face growing paler with every word. "You signed warrants for girls like they were livestock receipts," he said, his voice filled with disgust. "God help you, Judge." "God helps men with money," Harik muttered, his spirit broken. "Not today," Samuel said. Heavy boots pounded on the porch. The door opened, and Marshal Brennan entered, flanked by 2 deputies. Between them, in irons, was Tom Kirill. Grace stepped in behind them, pale but upright, her head held high. Jake followed, leaning against the doorframe, his hat in his hand. Brennan placed Kirill's ledger and the judge's signed confession side by side on Samuel's desk. "This is the case," the marshal said, his voice ringing with grim satisfaction. "We take them both to town. Then we take down every single person who fed this sickness." That night, for the first time in years, the people of Cedar Ridge saw powerful men in irons. Brennan posted federal guards at the town jail. Sheriff Daniels, a changed man, sent telegrams up and down the rail line, alerting authorities in Cheyenne and Denver. Margaret Sinclair, the banker's wife, didn't wait for the law. She gathered 5 other women from the church ladies group, marched to the yellow boarding house on Elm Street with 2 deputies, and hammered on the door. "Mrs. Dalton," Margaret said, her voice like cracking ice. "Open this door." The woman inside, Kirill's well-dressed recruiter, tried to burn her ledgers in the stove, but the deputies stomped the fire out and pulled a smoking book from the ash. The names were all there. Ages, prices paid, cities they were shipped to. The women of Cedar Ridge stood in that narrow, foul-smelling hall and did not look away. By morning, 4 young women came out of that house wrapped in blankets, blinking in the bright, clean daylight, free for the first time in months. The trial was swift. Judge Harwick was shipped east in chains to face a host of federal charges. A stern circuit judge sent by Brennan took his place. Kirill's lawyer tried to paint Grace as a liar and a temptress. He waived the release she had forced them to sign and called the whole thing a trick. Then Grace took the stand. In a clear, unwavering voice, she told the truth. Then another girl stood, and another, and another. The ledger told a colder, more damning truth than any voice could. Brennan laid out the papers, the contracts, the judge's confession, in neat rows for the jury to see. They did not take long to decide. Tom Kirill would hang. Mrs. Dalton would see the inside of a stone cell for many years. The men who had once laughed at Kirill's jokes in the saloon suddenly found the floorboards very interesting as the deputies led him past. When it was all over, it felt like Cedar Ridge could finally take a deep breath. The long, dark shadow that had hung over the town was gone. The burned-out East Barn at the Triple T rose again, its new timber bright and clean in the autumn sun. The whole community came to help. Men set posts and raised rafters. Women cooked and carried water. Rebecca Paulson, one of the freed girls, the one who had worked for Samuel's wife, found a home at the ranch, counting nails for Jake and smiling with her eyes whenever he looked her way. One clear morning, Samuel stood on the porch of a smaller house being built on his land, one that faced the same wide, beautiful view as the main house. He had a hammer in his hand and sawdust in his hair, and he realized with a sense of quiet wonder that the heavy, crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 5 long years was gone. Grace came up the steps, carrying 2 tin mugs of steaming coffee. "Mrs. Chen says you forget to eat when you build," she said, her smile easy and bright. "She's right," he said, taking the mug. He studied her in the clean morning light. The gray shadows were gone from under her eyes. She no longer flinched at sudden noises. There was a strength in her now, a deep, quiet calm that came from making a choice, not from enduring a fear. "I have a question," he said. She smiled, a knowing, gentle smile. "I know. I want you to stay," he said, the words feeling clumsy but necessary. "Not because you need my protection anymore. Because I need your laugh in this house. I need your hand on my arm when the wind blows hard. Will you stay, Grace?" "Yes, Samuel," she said simply, her eyes shining. "I will." He let out a breath he didn't even know he'd been holding. From the yard below, Jake let out a loud whoop, and the other men cheered. From the main house, Mrs. Chen cried for a moment, then laughed at herself. They were married under the golden cottonwoods by the river, with the Laramie Peaks standing like silent, ancient witnesses. Reverend Patterson read the vows, his voice steady and sure. Afterwards, cowboys played fiddles on the porch, and the whole town danced. Marshal Brennan leaned on the porch rail, watching the celebration with a rare, genuine smile. Sheriff Daniels stood beside him, his eyes clear, his stance easy, a man who had finally found his line and stood on the right side of it. When the stars came out, bright and cold in the vast Wyoming sky, Samuel and Grace walked to the edge of the yard, looking out over the dark, sleeping land. The night smelled of pine and clean wood shavings. The house behind them rang with laughter and music. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, her voice soft in the darkness. "That I can breathe," Samuel said, and he realized it was the first time it had been true since the fire. "I can finally breathe." Grace took his hand and held it to her heart so he could feel its steady, rhythmic beat. "Me too," she whispered. They stood there for a long time, quiet, feeling the wind on their faces. In the darkness, the frame of their new house stood against the sky like a promise. The land would not grow gentle. The winters would still bite. The markets would still swing, and life would still be hard. But the heavy, suffocating thing that had crushed his spirit was gone, burned away by courage and replaced by hope. They turned and walked back toward the light. If you believe that courage can change the world, and that even in the darkest places, a little bit of light can make all the difference, then don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what story's waiting just around the bend.